Thanks for inviting me again to this event. So I'll give a quick overview of the main initiatives we've put on the table in the Fit for 55 package, and then at what we have already for buses. I will say already in this package, we don't have much that is targeting buses specifically, but I think it is important to look at how these various initiatives will alter the overall transport system and how it will impact buses as well. So the first slide, please. So just to give the context, you probably all know we have this European Green Deal where we set a very high level overall commitment that Europe will become the first carbon neutral continent by 2050. We've also set a climate target plan where we looked at what we need in order to reach this target and reach our commitments under the Paris Agreement. And we said by 2030, we need to have an emission reduction for the whole European economy of 55%. So in this context, what does it mean for transport as a whole, including all different modes, the whole transport network? This means by 2050, we need our emissions to decrease by 90% in order to meet these objectives. So this is the framework in which we operate. And the next slide, please. We look at what this means concretely for transport. So, as I said, this is the framework. Last year, we published a sustainable smart mobility strategy where we put together the initiatives and overall policy drive that will reach us to allow us to reach these 90% emissions. So we have 10 flagship areas with key milestones, 82 policy actions, and a comprehensive analysis of what this means for transport as a whole and for the individual modes and different means of transport. What are the actions and how does this change the operating conditions if we are to meet this 90% emission reduction? The next slide, please. We look in more detail at the specific actions for road transport, and in particular, we have two milestones defined. By 2030, we expect at least 30 million zero-emission cars and 80,000 trucks on the road. And this means also having 3 million recharging and refueling points that are publicly accessible to support this fleet. And by 2050, we expect basically all vehicles on our road to be zero emission. So this is quite a challenging task, of course, and we need to support and push this transition. The next slide, please. So the strategy sets a number, as I mentioned, 82 policy actions. Among those, these are the ones that are more directly concerning road transport. We have a review of the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive, the rollout plan for alternative fuel infrastructure, initiatives for maritime and aviation, a review of the TEN-T guidelines, and an alliance for low carbon and renewable fuels. These are the ones that affect more directly our sector here that we are discussing today. The first three are published as part of the Fit for 55 package that we adopted in July this year, and the other two are coming between the end of this year and early next year. The next slide, please. So I mentioned the Fit for 55 package. This is I will not go into the details of individual initiatives because that will take the whole morning, frankly, but just to give you an idea of all the different elements, this is a very comprehensive package that addresses all the elements that we need to consider if we are to reach this 55% emission reduction by 2030. There's everything from the effort sharing, the emission trading system, energy taxation, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and we have the three initiatives I mentioned: Refuel EU Aviation, Alternative Fuel Infrastructure, and Fuel EU Maritime. And the next slide, we look into this in a little bit more detail. So when it comes to transport, we have new CO2 emission reduction objectives for cars and vans. Those for heavy-duty vehicles, including spreading these also to coaches and possibly buses, are coming next year. We have a revision of the alternative fuels infrastructure legislation, turning it into a regulation, and then, as I mentioned, initiative for aviation and maritime. The next slide, please. So the one that has probably more direct impact for our discussion today is the alternative fuel infrastructure regulation. Now, where we come from with this is that we see already a rapid growth of zero emission vehicles on our road. Cars and vans and buses in particular, but we also see trucks coming. We know that this deployment will accelerate dramatically over the next years based on both the legislation we are putting in place and commitment already taken by manufacturers, and we know announcement of new models and etc. So we know this is coming. We need to be sure that we have adequate infrastructure that can provide the supply of alternative fuel and in particular zero emissions, so electricity and hydrogen for this fleet. So when what we set as objectives in this regulation is we need to ensure sufficient deployment of publicly accessible recharging and refueling infrastructure, full interoperability between vehicle and infrastructure, and ensuring that it's easy to use, so that you have clear information as a customer, how much will I pay for my recharge or for my refueling with hydrogen. Is it easy to pay with common systems like a bank card and etc. I will say here already, this is about publicly accessible infrastructure. So this does not, the main focus here is not the charging or refueling infrastructure for captive fleets, for buses, for example. I think this will still impact the indirectly the bus sector, but the main focus here is on the recharging and refueling stations that are available to external customers. The next slide, please. So when it comes to this type of publicly accessible infrastructure, the proposal sets mandatory targets, and in road transport, what we have is targets for light duty vehicles. For electricity, we have a fleet-based target. So in each member state, we have to ensure a minimum amount of power installed per registered electric vehicle. And we also have distance-based target on the 10T core and comprehensive network. So this is, of course, the backbone of our transport infrastructure in Europe. And on the highways that compose this network, that we have to be sure that there is no more than a certain distance, 60 kilometers in practical terms, between charging pools, and that there's a minimum level of power provided by these pools so that you can have a fast charging while you're driving on the highway. For heavy duty vehicles, that is similar. We have a distance-based target along the 10T network. No, we do not have a fleet-based target, but we have specific requirements that there has to be charging point for overnight recharging in safe and secure parking areas for trucks. So when the truck is staying overnight, it can recharge, and in urban nodes. And these, for example, would be relevant also for buses and coaches, especially for interurban coaches. For hydrogen refueling, we have, again, a distance-based target along the 10T network and a requirement for urban nodes. I will mention also for hydrogen refueling, we are putting specific requirement for refueling at 700 bars and liquid hydrogen. We see that in the light duty segment and in the truck segment, 700 bars seems to be the preferred option. We know that for buses, especially urban buses, there is more of a 350 bar technology choice. Again, what we're looking in this regulation is the publicly accessible one. So that's why we're looking, the vehicles that we are targeting are the ones that are mostly going for the 700 bars. That does not, of course, prevent the bus fleets to stay with the 350. We also have some objectives for LNG, basically with the recognition that for road transport, we're going toward zero tailpipe emission, but LNG still has a role to play in the short, medium term, and the LNG coverage is already not complete, but almost. So basically, the idea is to complete the coverage by 2025, but then we don't put any more targets for that. The next slide, please. So, as I said, the proposal is focusing mostly on publicly accessible recharging and refueling infrastructure, but there is another key element beside the mandatory target that have this focus only, and that is the national policy frameworks. This is an instrument that we have in the current directive already, where we require member states to set the framework for the deployment of alternative fuel infrastructure in their territory. And in this context, we try to cover also all those elements that are not directly addressed in the target. And for example, one of the elements in the proposal is that member states have to include in the national policy framework measures to promote the deployment of recharging and refueling infrastructure in captive fleet, and in particular electric recharging and hydrogen refueling stations for public transport services. So we're not setting targets at the EU level for this, because this is indirectly covered by the Clean Vehicles Directive that I will speak about later, but we do require member states to take this into account and to promote this deployment. The next slide, please. And finally, I mentioned already there are operational requirement technical specification, including requirement for ad hoc payment, price transparency, and technical specification in terms of physical and communication standards. This is, as a reminder, the context, the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Directive. The current one is the context that we use, the legal instrument that we use to adopt the, to make mandatory the standards for example, the physical plugs and the pantograph for buses, etc. The next slide, please. So this is a bit of the context. As I mentioned at the beginning, in this package, we do not have many measures dedicated specifically to buses, but it is clear that clean buses have a key role to play in our decarbonization of our transport. Why? Because, well, they need to contribute to these 90% emission, and they do so in two ways. On the one hand, by being zero emission, but on the other hand, also by reducing transport by private cars. One thing that is important to keep in mind is that even a conventional bus is still better than the several cars that it's replacing. They also, zero emission buses bring local benefits, of course, in terms of air quality, noise, pollution, etc. And what we see constantly as a feedback from those cities that have made the switch already is that they increase the attractiveness of public transport by being more, silent, by having less vibration, etc., etc. And one thing that is important when it comes to clean buses, European cities really took the lead. I have to say, when we adopted Clean Vehicles Directive, we followed what the leading cities had done already. So it's something that is happening. We have a strong commitment from our cities. This is not something new. It's something that we are supporting and enforcing, but that was happening already. And one thing that is really important to keep in mind, of course, for the bus segment is that public procurement accounts for 70% of the bus market. So when we steer that, as we do with the Clean Vehicles Directive, we can really give clear market signals and drive the transition to zero emission mobility. The next slide, please. So in this context, I want to give a quick reminder on the Clean Vehicles Directive. I presented this in previous editions of this event, so I will not go into a lot of detail now again, but I just want to, first of all, remind everyone that now member states had to transpose this by the 2nd of August this year, so this is now applicable. It's a directive that covers all types of public procurement of cars, vans, buses, and trucks. So when I say all types, this means both when you're acquiring the vehicle, be it through purchase or lease or similar system, but also through contract services. So if you are a contracting authority or contracting entity, so if you are subject to EU public procurement law, whether you're buying the buses and running the network yourself, or you are assigning a contract to someone to run the bus network for you, these are both under the scope of the directive. The directive introduces the definition of clean minimum targets for their share in the total public procurement, with a sub-target for zero emission buses specifically. Now, these targets have to be met for the whole of the member state and over 2 reference periods. The first one has just started, 2nd of August this year, and it runs until 2025. And the second one is the following 5 years. Now, the directive sets the targets for the total, but it leaves full flexibility for the member state. So the directive does not say every city or every contracting authority has to reach 40% or 35% or 20%. It says the member state as a whole. When we look at the total number of buses that have been procured in a member state in the period from 2021 to 2025, at least a certain percentage of these have to be clean buses, and half of those have to be zero emission buses. So member state can distribute the effort between different areas of the territory, different types of contracting authorities and contracting entities, etc., as long as the total meets a target. Now, member states have done or are doing this in the transposition, so it is very important to see how this ambition has been distributed in each member state, so that for contracting authorities and contracting entities that you know what your target is. We've published last year a guidance notice going into the details and practicalities of how the Clean Vehicles Directive works in practice. We will provide further guidance, I expect, but this is for the moment the main document where you find it's a set of 30, if I remember correctly, questions and answers on really practical aspects of the implementation. The next slide, please. So this one, we can go really fast. I've already mentioned that. Here you have, if you are operating in Europe, these are the targets. Again, total of the number of buses procured in a member state over the 5-year period. And that means for Germany, for example, you have 45% of those buses have to be clean. That means fueled by alternative fuels. Under the definition, and half of these have to be zero tailpipe emissions, so 22.5%. Or if you're looking at the Netherlands, again, the numbers are the same. Poland, for example, 32.16, etc. The next slide, please. So that would be, again, a reminder of the Clean Vehicles Directive. And if there are questions, of course, I'm happy to discuss in more detail. Clean Bus Europe platform, I wanted to mention as well. This is an initiative that we've had in place for almost 2 years now. Unfortunately, COVID has slowed down a bit its implementation, but the directive sets obligations. The Clean Bus Europe platform is an initiative we put in place to help cities in this transition. And we do so through this initiative by providing capacity building, technical support, and knowledge transfer, and in particular, twinnings and study visits between host cities and target cities. It's a project that's managed by a consortium for us. The next slide, please. And you have the link here, of course. So the idea is that we have a set of host cities. You can see them listed here in the slide, that provide the knowledge backbone of the project. So these are cities that have already started deploying clean buses, and they can help target cities exchange best practices, show them how this is working in practice. The next slide, we see the target cities. This is a set of cities. It's by contract at least 2 per member state, but it can be a bit more. They are the main beneficiary. The idea is that we're looking at cities, especially medium-sized cities, that have decided that they want to switch to clean buses, but they do not have yet the specific expertise in-house. And we know, especially for medium-sized cities, this can be quite challenging. So the idea is that the project provides technical support and guidance, but also and especially provides twinning opportunities with the host cities. So the idea is that the transport experts from the target cities can, again, this was prepared pre-COVID, can spend a few working days within the host city, shadowing somehow, if you want, and exchanging with their counterparts in the host cities, so that they can look within. It's important for these kind of changes, especially with electric buses, when you're really not just changing the vehicle, but you need the whole network to somehow be adapted. It's a whole system, not just as a vehicle replacement. We think it is very important that the people who are actually doing this in reality on the ground, they can talk to each other and see the experience in practical terms. Yes, we tried this, it didn't work, we did it in a different way, or we had to realize that we had to change the depot in this and that way, or etc. So the practicalities that can only come from people who have actually done this experience. The next slide, please. So in addition to the target city, we have what we're calling follower cities. So these are cities that have an interest, they have signed the Clean Bus Declaration, so they've committed somehow to this transition. We are giving this, the idea of the follower cities is basically, because we have a limited budget, there's only a number of target cities we can have. But in order to expand, when we've seen that there were cities that expressed interest beyond the target cities, so we give access to all the activities, and except for the study visits and similar, again, this is all pre-COVID, they can join, but we cannot cover their travel expenses. So that is the basic difference between target and follower cities. I mentioned that this was all planned pre-COVID. The situation at the moment is that most of the activities over the past year have, of course, happened online. I mean, we see today that this is how we need to adapt also with this conference. We've also prolonged the duration of the contract so that some of the activities are taking place only online. And hopefully in the next year, we will be able to resume also the actual physical study visits and meetings. The next slide, please. So that was all from my side. I'm here for questions here, if any, but I hope I've given you a bit of an overview of what we are doing with the Fit for 55 package and in general with our support for clean buses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dario, for that very informative presentation. Dario, we don't see you anymore. Can you come back online? We have time for questions, and I have received a couple of questions. Yes, if you can also unmute yourself. We have about 5-7 minutes. For questions before we move on to the next session. For the attendees, please put your questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box, so it's easier for all the moderators to pick up the questions and put them forward to the panelists. The first question that has come up, Dario, is that what are the big challenges that you are facing from European Commission's perspective in executing or implementing these 82 policy actions? That's quite a number. So what are the big challenges that you are facing?
Well, I think there's so first of all, you will have seen in the Fit for 55 package, we're really covering everything, I would say. I mean, of course, I'm looking specifically at transport and at specific aspects of transport, but the package as a whole really addresses the whole economy. So there has been a long of work done in looking at the interactions between the different actions, because we're proposing at the same time to change the way we deal with energy taxation, the way we promote renewable energy, energy efficiency, alternative fuels in transport, and etc. So a first big challenge, and we're seeing, of course, a lot of questions on this, is that we had to do a very comprehensive analysis and impact assessment of the measures overall. And then, well, I think we have to be realistic here and know that this kind of transition will be challenging. It will require effort from everyone involved. We are doing our best. We need everyone to, to give a push there. But when you look at becoming carbon neutral between now and 2050, that is, we must not underestimate that. It is a major transition for our society as a whole. So there will be plenty of challenges, but then you need to go sector by sector and instrument by instrument and look into the details there.
Okay, okay. Rico from ING is asking, do you think the CVD, the targets will be raised under the future, the Fit for 55 plans?
No. We discussed this internally, of course, as well. I think there are two elements here. One is that when we adopted the Clean Vehicles Directive, one of the main objectives we had was to give long-term certainty and stability for investment. So if I look, and sorry, let me qualify my initial no, maybe it was a bit too. The targets between now and 2030, no, we don't plan to revise them. Because the whole idea was we want to give certainty. Now, if we put in place an instrument to tell market and operators, look, we give you the certainty to do your investment. Between now and 2030, you will have this level of demand for clean buses. We cannot really go back 2 years later and say, oh, yeah, no, sorry, this will change. And also, I think there is one other element. When you see at how the bus market is evolving in Europe, I think you see a much stronger push for zero emission than was anticipated 4 or 5 years ago. So somehow, I think one can expect that we will exceed, at least for the zero emission part, that we will exceed to what we have. So for post 2030, the directive itself foresees revision and future targets. And I think, well, by the time we get to the revision, and that will be post 2026, we will see it where we are, and we will consider, well, or someone else in my place possibly, but will consider the post 2030 targets. But for 2030, no, we have no plan at the moment to revise the targets.
Thank you. Bartholomew from TUV Nord is asking, there is information about LNG that you spoke about. What about CNG? So what are your thoughts on CNG?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I should have probably addressed that in the slide or when presenting already. So in the AFI, I mentioned already for LNG, the idea is that we aim to complete the network coverage, and that is what we're looking at. For CNG, our assessment is that basically for the current fleet, and when you see the market trends, we don't see a growth in CNG vehicles. And again, we are keeping in mind that for AFI, we're looking at publicly accessible infrastructure. We're not talking about infrastructure for captive fleets, for buses, for public transport. Basically, when we see the market trends, CNG vehicles are not substantially growing, and the network in terms of refueling stations is there. So what we have now, we think, is sufficient to cover the market needs. I mean, you will probably have some additional filling station here and there, but there isn't a need that would justify a legal instrument mandating something. For LNG, it's close, but we still have some gaps in the network, and we see in the past few years a growth in the number of LNG trucks. So the difference there is that for LNG, there is still a need in terms of refueling infrastructure. For CNG, it's not that we don't think it's needed, but we think it's already there. So we don't need to put targets in place.
Okay. There's a question on Clean Vehicles Directive. How are you measuring the targets under Clean Vehicles Directive? Is it part of the Clean Bus Europe platform, or is there any other platform through which you're measuring what a country has done, where they have reached, and where do they have to go?
So the way we count this is through the TED, the Tender Electronic Daily database. This is the database for public procurement. Basically, every public, I'm sorry, so those of you who work on this will know already by heart, but for anyone who might not be familiar with this is the database where every public procurement that falls under EU public procurement law has to be registered in this database. And the directive only covers public procurement that is under EU public procurement law. So by definition, every contract that's in the scope of the directive is being registered already in this database. For the first period, for the moment until 2023, We are taking a slightly indirect way of doing it. Basically, we are asking to fill in this information in the free text fields. As of 2023, we will have new fields in the database. For those contracts that are in the scope of the directive, there will be 3 specific fields: number of vehicle, number of clean vehicle, number of zero emission vehicles. So this will be 3 numbers you put in there, and that's it. And the big advantage of the database is that it allows you basically real-time monitoring, because all of this information is publicly available as soon as it's published. So that means the database will be the main tool for monitoring. Having said that, we have member states reports, and this will be the so in terms of day-to-day knowledge of the situation, this will be it. Member states will then use this information, and then from a legal perspective, it will be a report from the member state where they take this information from the database, put it in the report that they send to us. This is because they might be able to correct or provide additional information, etc. But that's how the monitoring will work.
Okay. I think we have time for just one last question.
Yeah.
There's a question from Gilbert from, I think, VDL Lithuania, if I've got that right. He says, thanks for the presentation. What are the considerations defined to have an intelligent decommissioning and recycling of e-bus and e-vehicles in general?
Okay, here we have, I think we have different elements here. In the Clean Vehicles Directive itself, we specify that, well, first of all, any second-hand counts as well. Retrofitting counts for the directive as well. So we are promoting ways of using as much as possible a vehicle. Once it comes to really end of life, I would say the main instrument here is the batteries legislation. So besides the vehicle itself, because the battery is of course the main concern here, and we are looking into, I mean, this is more on the environmental side, but we are looking at revising the legislation on batteries exactly to address this and make sure that this is treated in the best possible way. This goes, I'm afraid, a little bit outside my direct technical knowledge, but we do have legislation that's being revised on that.
Okay, great. With that, I'm going to bring this session to a close. Thank you very much, Dario, for joining us this morning. I know it's a busy day for you, but thank you for taking out time and joining us this year as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.